Good morning. Today we are going to wrap up Mollison's first chapter in Permaculture, a Designer's Manual, which I have right here. So in this chapter, Mollison sometimes gets a little bit poetic and philosophical, and I'm not going to cover those sections. I feel like sometimes those discussions detract from the real practicality of permaculture, and I want to focus on the practicality. So in wrapping up this first chapter, we're not going to talk about some of the sort of utopian concepts that he talks about. You can read through that and you may appreciate that. I'm going to stick to the design aspects of permaculture in my discussions here. So permaculture focuses on the places where we live and we grow food. Later, you will see that permaculture can also be applied to things like designing office space, designing production lines. It can be applied to architecture. It really applies to every aspect of the way we live. And the general idea of permaculture is to observe how energy moves, how heat, electricity, light, and Mollison includes water in his description of energy, how natural things move. And when you see how they move, you find that they are moving in the path of least resistance. And so when you follow the path of least resistance, you expend less energy, you retain more energy in your system. So that's the overall thrust of permaculture, and in wrapping up this chapter is kind of what we're talking about. So one of the interesting things that Mollison says in this chapter that I think a lot of people don't understand, and a lot of permaculture enthusiasts don't get, and I understand where they're coming from, and it is the idea that we should no longer go to the wilderness, carve out our new space, and build our farm there. What he wants us to do, what Mollison is suggesting we must do if we're going to be responsible, and if we're going to think about the fact that there are billions of us on this planet, is no longer go out to the wilderness to carve out new space, but rather we are going to work with the space that we have. We're going to work on degraded land. We're going to work on the areas we live and leave wilderness to itself. And this is very important to Mollison, and I think it is a very logical idea, but it's also difficult because people like me, people like you, love the idea of being a pioneer. And we're descended from colonists, we're descended from pioneers. This isn't always a good thing. Our instinct is to go out, carve out a new space. So his advice is not to do that. He wants us to restrict our designs to the places where we live, rehabilitate degraded land rather than cutting down healthy forest. And if the land is healing itself, let it heal. That is his advice. And I think that's very logical advice, but it's not advice that's easy to follow for somebody who idolizes sometimes the pioneer spirit. And as Americans, as Australians, as Europeans, that's kind of part of our culture. And like I say, not always a good part. It's gotten us into some trouble, and we need to dig our way out of that. And so we may need to be a little bit more thoughtful and respectful of nature than historically our ancestors have been. So the idea is we want to create sources of food and energy that are closer to or within the areas that human beings live. And so this is one of the reasons that I live in a city. I live in the city of Providence, Rhode Island, and I spend a lot of time trying to get the most out of my small space. Sometimes I'm very envious of all of you who have acres to play with, but one of the great things about only having a tenth of an acre here, a tenth of an acre there, is that I can really focus on what permaculture design can do to maximize the production in that space. And so this is one of the things that Mollison feels is important. And when you think about it, it's more energy efficient to live in a city because the infrastructure is there. If you move out to the country, you have to build that infrastructure. You have to bring that electricity out to you unless you're going to go totally off the grid. You're going to potentially bring other services out to you like roads and streetlights, and where people settle, people and society directs more energy. If we're already in a place, we save energy by staying there and by working within that area. So his suggestions to make these places where we live more effective include things like using our rooftops to divert and collect water. Now that's an issue that you have to be a little bit careful of because sometimes the asphalt on rooftops isn't so great for the consumption, of the water a little bit further downstream. So we got to think about that in our designs. But that is a really important idea, collecting water from the areas that we live. He suggests we create nearby fuel forests. Now, I'm not saying food forests, I'm saying fuel forests, so that we are storing the sun's energy and we can have a place to recycle the waste that we produce as a society. And if we're sending our waste out to a place like that, where the human waste can be turned into something that can later be used as fuel, that is a closed loop system. And it's a very efficient system. And it also doesn't carry with it the dangers and taboos of incorporating human waste into food production. So you're turning the human waste into fuel production, and then you're using other types of waste to create your compost and things that go back into the soil. So you want to think about closed loop systems, and that is what he's talking about. And he's also saying, once again, we need to remove ourselves more from places where we are competing with nature. So just something to think about, and I know that's hard. I feel like I get rejuvenated by going back to nature, and so I do, quite frankly. I hike a lot, spend a lot of time outdoors, but one needs to respect it when one does, and let sections of it be take care of itself. And so by stepping on it all the time, we're not helping. So sometimes it's important to stay on the paths. So in this chapter, Mollison also starts to describe the difference between a designed and a cultivated ecology and a natural ecology. And so we're talking about designing systems. And so those systems, even though they reflect the ebb and flow of natural energy like sunlight and wind and water, they are by nature what Bill Mollison says, he calls them anthropocentric. I don't know if this is a word outside of permaculture, but it means centered on the human. So the purpose is for us to satisfy our human needs. And the majority of the species in these sections are channeled to human use. So even though we're creating ecosystems that benefit all of the organisms in those systems, and by benefiting them, we benefit ourselves, but the end goal really in these systems is to create situations where we are the end beneficiaries, and then that's why we need to leave natural space so that can be that can benefit nature, not necessarily human beings all the time. But in a much more general sense, it will. Nature benefits us in that we breathe the air and we live in the atmosphere that is created that way. So the purpose is to satisfy human needs. And once again, we're talking about nutrient recycling. We're talking about creating closed systems. Now, I was talking about the community earlier, how closed system would be taking human waste, growing fuel forests with that, bringing that back as fuel. And so that's a closed loop system, and it's a small closed loop system. So this is opposed to, say, natural systems, which, like I say, satisfy the needs of organisms other than human beings. Now, there doesn't need to be human intervention in these landscapes because they will take care of themselves. And this is what Mollison says in this chapter. It says, in natural environments, the places that we would leave alone as true permaculture practitioners, they need no human input. The nutrients are recycled naturally. Now, water collection and energy retention happens naturally over time. And over time, basically more energy is stored than is released until you reach an equilibrium in these situations where the microorganisms and other creatures are breaking down the carbon from plants at an even rate, and there's a give and take with the environment. There's a bit of a stasis kind of situation where everything kind of reaches an equilibrium. We're kind of out of equilibrium right now, and that's why we see such dramatic changes in our environment. And we can talk about climate change and things like that at some point, but the Earth will reach some kind of balance with or without us, and that is my philosophy. And I'm supposed to be talking about permaculture, but we can talk about that at a different time. We're going to stick with permaculture today. I'm going to back away from that discussion, but the idea here is that we need to create our own complex living environments that are modeled on nature. And his idea behind that is that stable populations are created when there is stability, regional stability, so that people can feel comfortable stabilizing their population. When there is instability, people are more likely to have more children and make decisions that aren't necessarily beneficial for the environment. So you need to stabilize that, and the way that Mollison suggests doing this is through understanding the natural laws that we're dealing with. So permaculture defines these strategies now where we are able to retain more energy from the sun. And really the sun is the source of all of the energy that we use, whether it is from fossil fuels or from trees or from solar or from wind, because wind is created by the heat and cold and the displacement of different temperature air. And I am not explaining that very well, and that's because I don't really understand it very well. But I do know that without the energy of the sun, there wouldn't be any stored energy on Earth that would be usable for us in our designs, in our lives. So permaculture defines strategies to retain maximum energy from that. Now, permaculture isn't creating anything new here. And then Mollison stresses this. He wants us to understand that this is a system of observation of what already exists. We're observing how things work, and we're learning how to save time by designing around the way that things work. So we are minimizing energy loss with permaculture. And energy lost from a system, now think about this from the perspective of your own household. Things that you buy and that you throw away, that's energy lost, because that is something that goes out of the system and you've paid for it. You brought it in, it goes out. Things that you eat, and when you flush your waste down the toilet, that is energy lost, because there is energy value in that waste. Whether right now we're in a position where we can use that energy, that's debatable, certainly on a small scale. But when you send that out of the system, you need to replace them. That's why you have to go to the grocery store and get more food. What you recycle is also energy lost. Even though it's going back into what seems like a closed loop, it's not a closed loop system. A lot of what gets recycled doesn't really go back into the system in a usable way. And there's a huge buildup of stuff that we think we're recycling and that there's just no, right now, there's no real true market for. So that is also waste. We talk about household emissions, like when you burn fuel. If you burn it inefficiently, you've got emissions that are going out your chimney. If you burn it efficiently, well, then you get heat in your house, but then that heat dissipates through the walls, and that is energy lost from that system, from the house. And it goes back into the environment, and you don't get the benefit from the energy that is lost. There's only so much you can retain, and also you need to think about having a healthy flow of air through your house. But it's just important to think about retaining these kinds of energies. So even money spent on stuff you don't need, that is energy lost. And that's without even really getting to the garden. So every time you pick a piece of fruit, you take energy out of that system. And you need to replace the energy in that system. And as the organism that is in control of, and to a certain extent, and responsible for that environment, you need to be responsible for putting that back. And so people have relied a lot on fertilizer to put energy back into systems, into agricultural systems. This is not necessarily a holistic way of thinking about the soil and thinking about regenerating what the soil really has. What you're doing is basically you're putting vitamins back into the system, but you're not really building it back up the way that it needs to be built up to be a healthy system. So that's one of the things that permaculture will observe later on in further chapters. And we will talk more in future episodes about energy following the path of least resistance. This is a very, very, very important notion here, and that is what we are observing as permaculture designers. We are observing the way that energy moves, so we can see that these are ways that we might move, we might work to follow paths of least resistance. So studying nature, studying paths of least resistance, that's what this is all about. And that's what the real practicality here is. Basically, it's less friction and more working with systems that work. This all makes a lot of logical sense, but applying it is kind of against human nature, because you have to start to think about, this is what's really important to start to think about here, is that when we talk about the most efficient ways of doing things, that doesn't mean necessarily the most immediately cheap ways of doing things, or the way that is fastest and most immediately gratifying. Instead, what we're talking about, sorry, I've got a cat issue here. Instead, what we were talking about here, oh yes, I know. We're talking about the long game. We're talking about what is most efficient, most effective, if we are thinking about playing the long game. If we want to have children, if we want them to be able to live in an environment that is similar to or better than what we live in right now. So in the short term, it might be easier to take the easy way out. But I think if you look at the world as a fixed... Cats. If you look at the world and realize that it is a fixed size, you look at the population and you realize that the population is growing, and you look at the supply of farmland, that's not growing. So that equation just logically doesn't work. And I don't want to go too far into that, because we have been harangued about this, especially as environmentalists and people who believe in science. We have been hit over the head with this notion that we're running out of space, we're running out of time, I really don't want to focus on that. I want to focus on the positive, and that's mostly what, once we get beyond this chapter, what Mollison talks about. But he does talk quite a bit in this chapter about the difficulties we face and the challenges that we're going to have to overcome as a species. And so I think it's, we always have that in the back of our minds when we throw something away, when we do things that we know aren't necessarily as environmentally responsible as we feel like we should be. I think it's important to also realize that Bill Mollison was a human being. He was, in some ways, he talks a good game, but the man had 6 kids. And so when he talks about controlling the size of the population, controlling our own instincts, and he talks about that a lot, he himself wasn't always doing that, which just really illustrates for me, and I don't think it detracts from the general point here in that we have to do this. I think what it illustrates for me is that it's just so hard. I mean, even the man who wrote the book about permaculture, who talked so much about controlling the size of population, had 6 kids. So we shouldn't feel, I think, that we're not succeeding in our own efforts. We're fighting some very strong headwinds in our instincts and in our history as a culture. And so permaculture itself, as separated from Bill Mollison as a human being, permaculture itself is a very good strategy for dealing with what we will have to deal with over the course of the next 100 years. So I hope you've enjoyed this talk this morning. I know this was a bit of a long one. Wanted to push through the end of chapter 1 so we can get on to more of the design strategies and other ideas that permaculture has to offer, and it can help you in your design of your gardens, your landscapes, your homestead, and your house. And even sometimes you can think of it as a strategy to design your office space or your kitchen space. So some of the strategies we'll talk about are really effective for harnessing the energy of, say, an office, or harnessing the energy of a kitchen, and then using your energy as efficiently as possible in that space. So as we'll cover in the future. In the meantime, I really appreciate it if you give me a thumbs up, if you'd leave a comment. If you have other ideas about things that I talked about or that maybe I missed in this chapter, please leave them below. And really appreciate if you would subscribe to my channel. I'm trying to build up my subscription so we can get more information out to more people. And also let people know about the Food Forest Garden Club, foodforestgardenclub.org. You can go there and become part of our gardening community. We meet in person, online, on Zoom chats and things like that. We have forums, we have events, and we have contests, and it's a whole lot of fun. So please go check us out, foodforestgardenclub.org. In the meantime, I hope you have a really nice day.